The desperate encounter. The sky above the alien world was a deep shade of violet, with two suns sinking below the jagged mountains. Captain Daniel Carter adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the barren landscape. His ship, the Starfire, stood behind him, its engines still warm from the recent landing. Daniel had landed here for a simple mission: resource collection. His scanners had detected rare minerals beneath the rocky surface. It was supposed to be routine, quick in and quick out. But something about this place felt wrong. The wind was too silent. No signs of life, no distant howls, no rustling in the dry vegetation. The whole area felt abandoned, almost lifeless. Almost. As he stepped forward, his boots crunched against the dry earth. Suddenly, his ship's motion sensor beeped. Something was watching him. Daniel's muscles tensed. He reached for his blaster, his heartbeat steady but alert. Was it a wild creature, a bandit, or something worse? He turned slowly, scanning the rocks and shadows. Then he saw her. A figure emerged from behind a jagged boulder, tall, frail, but standing with quiet strength. She was alien, with smooth, lavender skin that glowed softly under the fading sunlight. Her long, dark robes were torn and dusty, and her large, silver eyes were filled with something Daniel had seen many times before: fear. But there was something else in her gaze: desperation. She took a hesitant step forward, her arms clutching something tightly. Two small figures peeked from behind her robes. Children. Daniel felt a wave of confusion. This planet was supposed to be empty. No settlements, no recorded life. But here they were, a mother and her children, lost and afraid. Before he could speak, the alien woman raised a trembling hand. "Human, please." Her voice was soft but urgent, filled with a pain that cut through the silence. Daniel's grip on his blaster loosened, but he didn't lower it completely. He had seen traps before. Desperate people did desperate things. He took a slow step forward. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed hard. Her breath was ragged, as if she had been running for miles. She shifted slightly, revealing the children clinging to her legs. The two small aliens looked just like her. Silver eyes, lavender skin, but thinner, weaker. Their tiny hands trembled, and their wide eyes darted around, scanning the sky as if something terrible was about to appear. Daniel frowned. They were afraid of more than just him. The woman took another step closer, and this time, her voice broke. "Please, take them." Daniel felt a sharp chill run through his spine. "Take them." She knelt on the ground, her arms tightening around the children. Her body shook as she tried to hold back sobs. "They have no one. I can't protect them anymore." "But you can." Daniel inhaled slowly, trying to process the situation. He had been in war zones, seen people in despair, but this was something different. "You're asking me to take your kids." His voice was calm but firm. The woman nodded, tears slipping down her pale cheeks. Daniel looked at the children again. They were too young, barely old enough to understand what was happening. And they were terrified. But why? Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. He turned slightly, scanning the landscape once more. The sky was darkening, and the wind had started to pick up. Then he saw it, a red flash in the distance. His ship's warning system blared loudly from his wrist device. Incoming vessels. Not friendly. The alien woman gasped, eyes wide in terror. She turned toward the sky and let out a soft whimper. "They found us." Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a mother asking for help. This was a mother running from something. He gritted his teeth and looked back at her. "Who's coming?" She clutched the children tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Syndicate." Daniel cursed under his breath. Of course. The Syndicate was a ruthless faction of intergalactic slavers and mercenaries. They raided weaker civilizations, taking prisoners, selling them to the highest bidder. And they never left survivors. Now he understood everything. She was their next target. The children were valuable cargo. Daniel looked at the sky. The red flashes were getting closer. He had minutes, maybe less. He turned back to the alien widow. "Can you run?" She looked down at her children, hesitating. She was weak, exhausted. She wouldn't make it far. Daniel made a decision. A crazy, reckless decision. "Come with me. Now." The woman's silver eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes." He didn't have time to explain. "But we have to go now." The children whimpered, clutching their mother's robes. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. Daniel grabbed the smallest child in his arms, feeling the weight of a responsibility he never expected. The woman lifted the older one. Then they ran. Behind them, the sky burned as the syndicate's ships descended like vultures. The widow's tragic story. Daniel's boots pounded against the rocky ground as he ran, the weight of the small alien child in his arms pressing against his chest. The child trembled but didn't make a sound. Behind him, the alien widow struggled to keep up, her breath ragged, her robes billowing as she carried her other child. Above them, the syndicate's ships loomed, their crimson lights cutting through the darkening sky like hunting eyes. The widow gasped, looking back just as a sleek black vessel broke through the clouds, its thrusters glowing with a menacing hum. They weren't just scanning. They had found them. Daniel tightened his grip on the child and picked up his pace. Almost there, he shouted over the roaring wind. Ahead, the Starfire stood waiting, its ramp still down, engines flickering with life. It was their only chance. A warning shot blazed past them, scorching the ground just a few feet away. The widow flinched, shielding her child. The little one in Daniel's arms whimpered. "No time to be scared, kid," he muttered, shifting his grip. "Hold on." More shots fired. The syndicate wasn't here to negotiate. They wanted their targets, and they wouldn't care who got in their way. Daniel reached the ship first, bolting up the ramp and slamming his hand against the emergency lift button. The widow staggered in behind him just as another blast barely missed the ship's hull. The ramp hissed shut. The ship rumbled. They were in. Daniel didn't wait. He ran to the cockpit, tossing aside his gear and slamming his hands onto the control panel. Come on, come on." The engines roared to life. The ship trembled. He barely had time to glance over his shoulder. The widow had collapsed to her knees, still clutching her children, her face drenched in exhaustion and fear. He should have asked questions. He should have figured out what the hell he had just gotten himself into. But there was no time for that. Daniel gritted his teeth, gripped the controls, and punched the thrusters. The Starfire shot into the sky just as another syndicate blast tore into the ground where they had been standing seconds ago. The ship rattled violently, alarms blaring. Red warning lights flashed across the dashboard. They were being followed. Daniel barely had time to react before the comms crackled to life. A deep metallic voice sneered through the speaker. "Captain, you have something that belongs to us." Daniel didn't answer. He focused on the controls, pushing the Starfire harder. The ship groaned under the pressure, but he didn't care. The syndicate vessel behind them was faster, sleek, built for pursuit. They weren't going to outrun it. A voice whispered behind him. "Who are they?" Daniel turned his head slightly. The widow was there, standing weakly behind his chair, her eyes locked on the enemy ship chasing them. "The syndicate," Daniel said flatly. "Slavers. Killers. Take your pick." The widow flinched as if the words themselves had cut her. Her hands instinctively went to her children, pulling them close. Daniel exhaled sharply and looked back at the pursuing ship. His fingers hovered over the weapons system. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even the kind of guy who usually picked up strays. But as he glanced at the two small alien children, their terrified faces watching him like he was the only thing between them and death, something shifted inside him. He wasn't about to let the syndicate take them. Not today. Daniel slammed a button, and the ship's cannons whirred to life. The battle had begun. A dangerous decision. The Starfire shuddered as the Syndicate ship fired a plasma bolt, the blast narrowly missing Daniel's hull. The impact sent a violent shockwave through the cockpit. Red warning lights flickered across the control panel. Shields at 62%. Daniel gritted his teeth. The enemy ship was faster, and in a straight chase, he had no chance of outrunning them. His fingers flew across the controls, switching to evasive maneuvers. Behind him, the Widow clutched the cockpit railing, her silver eyes locked on the Predator chasing them through the dark void. Her breathing was uneven. She had been running for too long. One of the children, the smaller one, barely older than a toddler, was whimpering softly, too weak to cry out loud. The older child just stared at Daniel, silent but watching. Daniel's hands tightened around the control stick. This wasn't just an escape anymore. This was survival. "Hold on," he growled. He suddenly killed the thrusters, making the Starfire drop like a rock. The enemy ship shot past them, momentarily losing lock. Daniel seized the opening, flipping the ship's engines to full power and diving into a nearby asteroid field. The Widow gasped. "What are you doing?" "That's our only shot," Daniel finished. The Syndicate ship turned sharply, its black hull slicing through space like a blade. It followed them into the asteroid belt, weaving between the giant floating rocks with eerie precision. Daniel cursed under his breath. Of course, they weren't amateurs. A sudden explosion rocked the ship as a Syndicate blast grazed one of the nearby asteroids, sending debris smashing into their left wing. Shields at 47%. "Damn it," Daniel muttered. He needed a plan. Fast. He pulled up a holo display of the asteroid field. A cluster of dense metallic rocks hovered just ahead. If he could time it right. The enemy ship closed in, plasma cannons heating up. Daniel exhaled sharply. Time to roll the dice. He slammed the manual override, flipping the Starfire upside down, just as an asteroid the size of a battleship drifted into their path. The Syndicate pilot didn't see it in time. The enemy ship tried to swerve, but it was too late. The massive rock clipped their left wing, sending their ship spiraling into the asteroid field. Daniel didn't stay to watch. He punched the hyperdrive. The Starfire vanished into the void. Moments later, safe for now, the ship hummed softly as it drifted in the quiet of hyperspace. For now, they were safe. Daniel let out a breath, his hands still tight on the controls. His body buzzed with leftover adrenaline. He turned his chair slowly, facing the Widow and her children. The Widow sank onto the floor, her shoulders trembling. She hadn't expected to survive. The older child still stared at him, not with fear, but with something else. Hope. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered, looking at the Widow. "I just risked my life for you. I think I deserve some answers." She looked up at him, exhausted but grateful. "You do," she whispered. Daniel crossed his arms. "Start with your name." She hesitated before answering. "Navira." Daniel nodded. "And them?" He gestured to the children. "Their names are Carol and Syrah." She brushed a trembling hand over her son's head, her eyes soft despite the exhaustion. "They are all I have left." Daniel's jaw tensed. He had guessed as much. "And the Syndicate. They were after you." Navira nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They came to our world 2 months ago. They destroyed our city, took our people, killed the rest." She closed her eyes. "My husband was one of them." Daniel felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had seen war before. He had seen families ripped apart, but somehow, hearing it in her quiet, broken voice made it hit differently. "I ran," Navira continued. "I hid the children. I thought, if I could just keep moving, I could protect them." She let out a shuddering breath. "But the Syndicate never stops hunting." Daniel leaned back in his chair. His mind was already racing with what to do next. "You're saying they'll keep coming for you?" Navira's silver eyes locked onto his. "Yes. Until we're dead. Or worse." Daniel exhaled sharply. Great. That's just what I needed. A long silence stretched between them. Navarra studied him, her gaze full of quiet desperation. You could leave us somewhere. A colony. A space station. Somewhere safe. Daniel's gut twisted. He wasn't the caretaker type. He wasn't built for this. But as he looked at the two small, fragile children, alone in the universe, hunted, helpless, he knew he couldn't just walk away. A strange, unfamiliar weight settled in his chest. You don't have a plan, do you? He muttered. Navarra shook her head. Only to keep them alive. Daniel ran a hand down his face. What the hell was he supposed to do now? He sighed and stood up, walking toward the control panel. His fingers hesitated before finally making a decision. He tapped the comms and sent a secure transmission to an old contact. Dr. Evelyn Ross. If anyone could help, it was her. He turned back to Navarra. I know someone. A human scientist. She works with an underground network. If anyone can hide you from the syndicate, it's her. Navarra's eyes widened slightly. You would do that? Daniel shrugged. I already stuck my neck out. Might as well follow through. The older child, Carol, suddenly stepped forward. His tiny hand tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Daniel looked down, surprised. The child's silver eyes were wide, full of something deeper than gratitude. Trust. Daniel swallowed hard. That felt dangerous. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But he wasn't about to let the kid down. He looked at the navigation screen. Evelyn's outpost wasn't far. He punched the coordinates. Hold tight, he muttered. We're not done yet. With a final push, the Starfire vanished into the void. Unwanted pursuit. The Starfire soared through hyperspace, its engines humming with steady rhythm. The cockpit lights cast a soft glow over Daniel's tired face as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the endless stream of stars rushing past. Behind him, Navarra sat on the floor, holding her children close. The exhaustion in her silver eyes was clear, but she refused to sleep. She had been running too long to trust rest. Daniel watched her from the corner of his eye. He had seen fear before. He had seen hopelessness. But this was something else. Ross better pick up, he muttered, pressing a button on his control panel. The screen flickered, static crackling for a moment before a sharp, tired voice answered. Carter, it's been years. What kind of trouble are you bringing me now? Daniel smirked. Dr. Evelyn Ross hadn't changed. Nothing much, he said, glancing at the alien family behind him. Just a widow and 2 kids being hunted by the syndicate. There was a long pause, then a heavy sigh. You always bring me the worst cases. Daniel leaned forward. You in or not? The screen flickered as Ross sighed again, rubbing her temples. Where are you? Heading to your outpost. We need a place to hide. Fast. Ross frowned. If the syndicate is tracking them, hiding isn't enough. We need to erase their trail. She hesitated. Are they chipped? Navarra stiffened at the word. Daniel's stomach dropped. Of course. The syndicate didn't just track people. They tagged them. Ross caught his expression and cursed. Damn it, Carter. If they're chipped, that means. A warning siren blared through the ship. Proximity alert. Daniel's eyes snapped to the radar. A ship had dropped out of hyperspace behind them. The syndicate had found them. The chase begins. The Starfire jerked violently as enemy blasters fired, shaking the cockpit. Daniel cursed, gripping the controls. Navarra clutched her children, her breathing ragged. How did they? Daniel's fingers flew across the screen, scanning. There, a faint tracker signature. The chip. They're tracking you, Daniel muttered. Ross, tell me you've got a way to fix this. Ross's voice crackled through the speakers. You need to disable the chip. Fast. But it's in their neural system. If you screw it up, you could fry their brains. Great, Daniel muttered. Just what I needed. Behind them, the syndicate ship fired another blast, barely missing the hull. No time. Ross's voice was sharp. Get them to a med station or... Daniel cut the call. He turned to Navira. How fast can you remove the chip? Navira's face paled. I don't know how. Daniel gritted his teeth. Then we need a plan. Now. His mind raced. The only way to escape would be to jump into uncharted space. A gravity well, a nebula, anything to block their signal. His eyes flickered across the map. And then he saw it. A derelict warship graveyard, floating on the edge of an abandoned system. A ghost fleet. Buckle up, Daniel said, punching the controls. We're flying into the dead zone. The graveyard of war. The Starfire dropped out of hyperspace, plunging into the cold silence of the ghost fleet. Ancient warships, rusted, broken, shattered, drifted in the darkness like the bones of fallen giants. Twisted metal hung in zero gravity, the remains of battles long forgotten. Behind them, the Syndicate ship followed, slowing slightly. Daniel smirked. They were being careful. Good. He maneuvered the Starfire through the wreckage, weaving between the ruined vessels. The Syndicate ship kept its distance, scanning cautiously. They didn't know what was hiding in the debris. And that was the point. Daniel cut the engines. The ship went dark. The Syndicate stopped, waiting, hunting. Inside the cockpit, Navira held her children close, her breath shallow. What now? She whispered. Daniel's voice was calm. Now we wait. Seconds passed, then minutes. The Syndicate ship drifted closer, scanning. Daniel tapped a control, activating an old distress beacon hidden inside one of the wrecked warships. The Syndicate ship immediately turned, sensors locking onto the false signal. Daniel smirked. They took the bait. As soon as they moved toward the distress signal, Daniel hit the thrusters, hard. The Starfire shot through the wreckage, vanishing into the shadows. The Syndicate ship realized too late. An ancient warhead, long dormant, now unstable, detonated as they triggered the wrong wreckage. A firestorm of debris erupted. The Syndicate ship was swallowed in the explosion. Daniel didn't wait to see the aftermath. He pushed the Starfire into hyperspace. A moment of silence. The ship hummed softly, steady once more. The only sound was the children's quiet breathing as they clung to their mother. Navira slowly looked up at Daniel. You saved us, she whispered. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, well, I'm getting used to it. She hesitated, then said softly, I owe you everything. Daniel sighed, adjusting the ship's course. Not yet, he muttered. We still have a Syndicate chip to deal with. Navira nodded slowly. Then what happens? Daniel glanced at the two small children, watching him silently. What happens? He didn't know yet, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving them behind. Not anymore. The Starfire vanished into the void, carrying them toward an uncertain future. The widow's last wish. The Starfire drifted in the quiet void, its engines humming in the background. The chaos of the chase was behind them, but the tension remained. Daniel sat in the cockpit, staring at the holo screen in front of him. The Syndicate tracker chip was still active. It was a ticking bomb. Until it was removed, the enemy could find them again. Behind him, Navira sat hunched against the wall, her two children sleeping against her. The moment of peace was temporary, and she knew it. Daniel let out a breath and tapped the comms. Dr. Ross picked up immediately. You're alive, she said dryly. Good. Now tell me you didn't do something stupid. Daniel smirked. Depends on your definition. Ross rolled her eyes. Tell me you at least lost the Syndicate. For now, Daniel said. But the chip is still active. Ross leaned forward, serious now. Then you're on borrowed time. Daniel exhaled. They needed to remove it. Fast. Where do we go? Ross hesitated. Then she sent coordinates. There's a hidden outpost in the Titan Rift. We got medical tech there. If you get them to me, I can remove the chip. Daniel glanced at Navarra. The Titan rift was deep space, dangerous, unstable, but their best shot. He nodded. We're on our way. Ross's voice softened. And Carter? Daniel raised a brow. Ross sighed. I know you. Don't get attached. Daniel glanced at the sleeping children. Too late for that. He cut the call and set course. Titan rift, here they come. The weight of a mother's love. The ship drifted in the quiet as hyperspace stretched ahead. Navarra sat up, watching Daniel carefully. Her eyes held something new, a quiet knowing. You're not just doing this out of kindness, she said softly. Daniel didn't look at her. No. You're running from something too. Silence. She wasn't wrong. Daniel had spent years drifting, taking jobs on the edge of civilization, never staying long. He had nothing to go back to. And now, for the first time in a long time, he had people depending on him. Navarra studied him. Then, after a long pause, she reached into her robes and pulled something out, a small worn pendant. She held it out. This belonged to my husband. Daniel hesitated. I can't take that. Navarra smiled faintly. It's not for you. It's for them. She glanced at her sleeping children. One day, when they are older, tell them about him. Tell them he fought for them. Daniel swallowed. He didn't deserve that kind of trust. But he took the pendant anyway, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in his palm. Navarra's voice was softer now. Promise me you'll protect them. Daniel looked at her. For the first time, she wasn't just asking for help. She was giving them to him. A long silence stretched between them. Then Daniel nodded. I promise. Navarra closed her eyes. And for the first time, she allowed herself to rest. A fatal truth. Hours passed. The Titan rift was close. But something was wrong. Daniel sat at the control panel, running a health scan on the ship's passengers. He wasn't a doctor, but the readings flashed in red. Navarra's vitals were failing. Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned to see her, still resting against the wall, her breathing shallow. Too shallow. He walked over and knelt. Navarra. She opened her eyes slowly. She had known. She had known this whole time. Daniel felt a sharp sting of anger. Why didn't you tell me? She smiled weakly. Because it doesn't matter. Daniel clenched his fists. The hell it doesn't. Navarra exhaled softly. The syndicate used experimental weapons. On our people. The wounds don't heal. She shook her head. I knew I wouldn't survive long. Daniel's chest tightened. She had been running, not for herself, but to buy time for her children. She looked at him. That's why I asked you. Daniel swallowed hard. He had made a promise. Navarra reached up, her cold fingers brushing his hand. Don't let them grow up afraid. Daniel felt something break inside him. He had seen soldiers die. He had lost friends. But this was different. Navarra gave him one last grateful smile. Then she closed her eyes. And she was gone. A new purpose. The ship was silent. The children still slept. They didn't know yet. Daniel sat beside Navarra's still body, staring at the small pendant in his hand. His hand curled around it tightly. A promise. He stood up, walking back to the cockpit. The Titan rift loomed ahead. But this wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about giving those kids a future. Daniel set his jaw, gripping the controls. The Starfire shot forward. Standing against the syndicate, the Titan rift stretched before them, a swirling abyss of cosmic storms and shattered moons. Lightning arced across the void, illuminating the twisted wreckage of ships lost to the rift's violent pull. Daniel had flown through war zones, asteroid belts, and syndicate blockades, but nothing compared to the chaos of the rift. And now he had 2 orphaned children sleeping behind him, a dead mother in the cargo hold, and the syndicate still hunting them. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was personal. He gritted his teeth and gripped the controls. No turning back now. The final pursuit. Just as the Starfire neared the safe zone, the alarm blared. Daniel's stomach dropped. The Syndicate had found them. 3 enemy ships dropped out of hyperspace, their black hulls gleaming with red lights. Daniel slammed his hand on the comms. "Ross, tell me you've got a plan." Ross's voice crackled through the speakers. "You need to get inside the station's shield perimeter. Now." Daniel yanked the controls, dipping into the rift's gravity currents. The ship buckled as he dodged a Syndicate blast. Navira's children stirred awake, frightened by the chaos. Daniel's voice was sharp but steady. "Strap in. It's gonna get rough." The Syndicate pursued aggressively, their weapons locking onto him. Daniel smirked. "Fine. Let's play." He jerked the thrusters, diving into the storm clouds of the rift. A deadly game of cat and mouse. Inside the rift, sensors were useless. Lightning streaked across the void, disrupting enemy tracking systems. Daniel twisted the ship through the wreckage of long-dead warships, using the massive debris as cover. One Syndicate ship followed too close. Daniel spotted a torn-apart dreadnought ahead. A jagged hull fragment floated right in his path. He waited until the last second, then flipped the ship sideways, squeezing through a narrow gap. The Syndicate pilot wasn't so lucky. The enemy ship collided with the wreckage, bursting into a fireball. 2 left. Ross's voice crackled in again. "Daniel, you've got 30 seconds before I activate the shield gate. If you're not inside, you're dead." Daniel cursed. The Syndicate ships were still closing in. He needed a way to shake them. Fast. Then he saw it. A collapsing moon, its core exposed and spewing gravitational pulses. It was unstable, unpredictable, deadly. Perfect. Daniel gunned the engines, heading straight for the dying moon. The Syndicate followed. They had no choice. As they reached the moon's gravity well, Daniel cut his engines. The Syndicate ships shot past him, right into the gravitational pull. Daniel punched the thrusters in reverse, barely escaping. The Syndicate pilots weren't so lucky. The moon's gravity crushed them like tin cans. Game over. The shield gate closes. Daniel barreled toward the Titan station, the shield perimeter looming ahead. Ross's voice shouted through the comms. "Now, Daniel, or you Ed." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Hold on, kids." He slammed the thrusters to max, the ship shaking violently as it raced toward the station. The shield gate began closing. The Starfire shot through. Just as the shield sealed shut, Daniel let out a breath, his body finally relaxing. They made it. A new life begins. The Titan station was quiet, hidden in the depths of the rift, safe from Syndicate control. Daniel carried Navira's body in his arms as he walked through the station's corridors. She deserved a proper farewell. Ross met him at the medical bay, scanning the children with concern. "They're dehydrated, exhausted, but they'll live." Daniel nodded, relief washing over him. But then Ross looked at him with sharp eyes. "And you?" Daniel hesitated. He looked at the 2 children clinging to his jacket. He thought about Navira's last words, the promise he made. Daniel exhaled. "They're mine now." Ross studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You always were a reckless idiot." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, but I think I'm starting to like it." The children didn't fully understand yet, but they didn't need to. They weren't alone anymore. And for the first time, in a long time, neither was Daniel. A new beginning. The Titan station floated in the depths of the rift, hidden from Syndicate eyes. Its metal halls were worn but sturdy, a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. For the first time in days, Daniel Carter wasn't running. Yet he wasn't at peace either. He stood in the station's observation deck, staring out at the cosmic storm beyond. The violet and gold lightning danced through the void, as restless as he felt. Behind him, Dr. Evelyn Ross approached, arms crossed. "You've been quiet," Daniel smirked. Never knew you cared. Ross rolled her eyes. I don't, but the kids do. Daniel turned. The two small alien children stood in the doorway, silent, watching him. He felt the weight in his chest again, the weight of responsibility, of a promise made to a dying mother. Navira's last words still echoed in his mind. Don't let them grow up afraid. Daniel ran a hand over his face. I don't know how to do this, Ross. Ross arched a brow. Fly through asteroid fields. Escape syndicate hunters. Outsmart warlords. Sure, but taking care of two kids? Impossible. Daniel sighed. She wasn't wrong. Ross softened. But you've already made up your mind, haven't you? Daniel glanced back at the children. They were still watching him, eyes full of uncertainty. They didn't speak, but their message was clear. What happens now? Daniel let out a slow breath. Yeah, he muttered. I have. Letting go of the past. The station's memorial chamber was quiet. A small ceremonial pyre had been built in the center, its soft blue flames flickering against the walls. Daniel stood beside it, holding Navira's pendant in his palm. The children stood next to him, their small hands clutching his jacket. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they understood loss. Ross placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. This is the part where you say something. Daniel exhaled, staring at the flames. She fought for them, he said quietly. She ran, she suffered, she never gave up. All so they could have a chance. He looked down at the children. I won't waste it. With that, he let the pendant drop into the fire. The flames flared for a moment, then faded to embers. It was done. For the first time, Navira could rest. And for the first time, Daniel could move forward. Fatherhood, ready or not. Daniel leaned against the ship, arms crossed as he watched the kids explore the station. For the first time, they weren't afraid. Carol, the older one, was staring at a holomap of the galaxy, his small hands tracing the glowing constellations. Curious. Syra, the younger one, was clumsily trying to grab Ross's lab equipment. Fearless. Ross smirked. You're in for hell, Carter. Daniel smirked back. Yeah, I know. He walked over to the kids and knelt down. They stared up at him, waiting. Daniel exhaled. All right, listen up. First rule of flying on my ship. Syra blinked. Ship. Daniel grinned. Yeah, the Starfire. She's home now. Carol tilted his head. Home. Daniel's expression softened. They had never really had one, had they? Well, you do now. Syra's tiny hands tugged at his sleeve. What? Second rule. Daniel smirked. Rule 2. You don't touch the weapons panel unless you want to crash us into a star. Syra giggled. Carol nodded seriously, as if memorizing it like a battle plan. Daniel stood, stretching. And rule 3. He looked at them. Carol tilted his head. What? Daniel smiled. We stick together. Syra beamed. Carell hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out and took Daniel's hand. Daniel felt something inside him shift. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was family. One last flight. Ross walked up. So, what now? Daniel smirked. You tell me. You're the genius. Ross rolled her eyes. The syndicate isn't done with you. You've humiliated them. Daniel's smirk widened. Yeah, feels good. Ross sighed. If you're serious about this, about them, you can't just run forever. You need allies. A real plan. Daniel nodded. I'll figure it out. Ross studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Well, you're an idiot, but you're their idiot now. Daniel laughed. Dan right. He turned back to the Starfire, the kids following close behind. As the ramp lifted, Carl and Syra looked back at the station one last time. Then they looked up at him. Daniel gave them a nod. Ready? Syra grinned. Carol straightened. And with that, they took off into the stars. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was a new beginning. For all of them.